Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to have you here with Marie Wu. Marie has a pen name that she writes under, Ron de Beaulieu. De Beaulieu first came to St. Paul for college. She left for a year but couldn't stay away and came back to the area to go to grad school at the University of Minnesota. She holds a master's degree in history and also sociology, and she now lives in Minneapolis and loves to explore St. Paul. Her most recent publication is St. Paul, Murder and Mayhem, and she's also the author of Minneapolis Murder and Mayhem. Welcome. So
Thank you.
tell us about your new publication. I want to congratulate you. It was available on October 2nd of 2023. We're very happy for you and looking forward to reading it. So tell us a little bit about your new book.
My book, St. Paul, Murder and Mayhem, covers the history of St. Paul from its days as an early uh, Euro-American settlement, primarily Euro-American settlement, until the bloody fall of 1874. And so it follows the political history um, as well. So in my first book, Minneapolis Murder and Mayhem, is all about the city, like it's hyper local to the city. But with St. Paul being the capital, it's so entwined with the history of the state. There was this very powerful force in the region. And addition to being this like disreputable whiskey town, like these like sort of interesting, these things are going at the same time, that it was like this crucial hub and like also just infamous.
It's very interesting how you describe it as the hub of the state being the capital. So it sounds like it would be an interesting time and exploration of the beginnings of our politics in our state. So what led you to write this book about St. Paul after writing about Minneapolis?
I had so much material about St. Paul because so many books that are about St. Paul are also about Minneapolis. But there's so much like material about St. Paul that I had picked up. It was just fascinating, and it was like a shame that I couldn't like fit it all in. Um, so it made sense to have another book. Um,
Interesting.
so I could focus on all of that material I'd accumulated. And what I thought was fascinating is how sources about the same topics that were written by people in Minneapolis versus written by people in St. Paul will tell a different version of events, like from the pioneers. Like they remember things differently. The St. Paul pioneer sources were better informed about Fort Snelling because there was a more continuous culture shift, because the squatters on the West Bank settlement um, were kicked off by the commandant at Fort Snelling, and they went to what's now St. Paul.
Mm.
And so actually the legacy of Fort Snelling is St. Paul, and the land on the West Bank, after a terrible treaty with the Dakotas, um, opened up land quite a bit later. So the people in Minneapolis didn't have that sort of historical memory. I would like notice these small things where the Minneapolitans might like misinterpret what had happened at Fort Snelling during those early years. Like almost like it's a game of telephone.
Mm.
I feel like the St. Paul sources were ones that I wished I had read before writing my section on Fort Snelling in the Minneapolis
Mm.
one, because it was just like much richer detail.
Are there any themes that are compared across your two books, or any themes that are threaded between the two books that you've written?
I would say the big one is the river, but in Minneapolis, the falls is the really big deal, the manufacturing.
Mm.
And in St. Paul, the really big deal is the confluence
Mm.
at the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River. The native peoples, the native nations, having given up their land in these treaties, ceded their land in these treaties, got cash payments. And so the government gave them the money. The federal government gave them the cash. And then they spent it at trading posts, like primarily at St. Paul. And that was the cash that funded like the region. It
Mm.
was like the main source of money came from overcharging natives for
Mm.
uh, goods in St. Paul. And so that's it. It was about convenience. It was also about all these sort of pecuniary circumstances. And in Minneapolis, not that there was none of that, but it was much less significant. It was much more about how do we use the falls.
So with the connections, even connections that may be understood through the story of the histories, right? The history events that you're displaying throughout your body of work, are you seeking to make those connections or single out the stories of the two cities separately?
Um, they were so separate at the time that it seemed the thing to do. Um, the because Minneapolis coming along later, um, they and also by that time the natives getting pushed out. So it was a totally different uh, totally different culture and circumstances and economy because of the fact
Mm.
that they were no longer there to um, as a regular source of cash.
Mm.
Um, and also, it was a very like in St. Paul, like they were like, especially in the early days, they were in and out. There's a fairly high rate of intermarriage, um, and there were also a lot more poor people who had come to St. Paul, like voyagers, adventure seekers, um, whiskey sellers, trappers, traders who were often fairly disreputable, um, the type 2B squatters. And then, but but in the case of Minneapolis, it was more um, like, or at least this is how they present themselves, and I haven't seen anything to the contrary. More like the stereotypical pioneer we're thinking about, like
Mm.
the Ingalls family.
Mm-hmm.
And they were often, yes, they were poor, but they were there to like till land. They were there to set up claims.
Mm.
And there was like they were not by any means. I'm saying they were saints. A joke I make in the book that Saint Paul called that settlement referred to that settlement for a time at the beginning as All Saints,
Mm.
and I said something like that it was undeserved. They were pioneers roved in gangs as
Mm.
protection from other pioneer gangs who would basically patrolling to make sure that nobody jumped their claims. People would like sleep with a shotgun at their
Mm.
side um, to scare off anyone who would come and try to kick them out of their claim. There was still violence and dishonesty, and there were land sharks. Whereas in St. Paul, there was quite a bit more murder. A lot of it alcohol related, because it was a whiskey town.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the reason that the justification for kicking those people, the white people, off of out of Fort Snelling, the civilian whites, to the East Bank, was they were selling whiskey
Mm.
to like all and everybody, and it was very dangerous for the soldiers. Um, and it was also The traders in particular, who often people were both whiskey sellers and fur traders. They developed these like pseudo friendships with native people and become their drinking buddies, and then rip them off. The level of alcohol was also led to conflict, like international conflict. It like exacerbated tensions between the various tribes in the region, primarily the Dakota and the
Mm.
Chippewa. At the time, Fort Snelling authorities were like, whiskey in the region is making everything worse. Like, they would not be fighting like this if our people weren't persuading them to drink. In fact, the fur traders, to a certain extent, benefited from the conflict because they were the one who sold the arms. Fort Snelling was supposed to be there to protect trade, economic interests of the state. It actually wasn't there to defend against Indians. It
Mm.
was there to defend against foreign traders, like primarily the British. The traders in general, just very, very bad behaved, very disreputable. And the main task of Fort Snelling was controlling the traders for breaking rules. And they weren't supposed to be selling
Mm.
whiskey at all. No, like
Interesting.
because it was leading to so much violence and
Hmm.
conflict in the region. Um, and so the white people went over to the East Bank. They thought that they were allowed to live there, but they just meant that the soldiers just crossed the river.
Mm.
And it like there was oh the same conflict was still going on. It hadn't changed a thing. Um, and so the commandant drew a border of the reservation to include the East Bank. That's a lot of St. Paul. Like his dividing line is like the city core.
Mm.
On the other side of his dividing line, the far side is the city core now. Um, and he said all the white people have to leave.
Mm.
You all have to get much further away from here. And they thought they had the right to be here. At this point, there had been a treaty signed with the Dakotas that opened up the East Bank, so they thought we this is okay, this is legal. Until like that innovation of we're just going to pretend that the military reservation is bigger than anyone ever thought. Like at no point had it been believed that the military reservation would cross the river. The military sent an investigator who said that the white people in the something like such is the character of the white people in the region, they might actually mutiny, like if they're like allowed to have this as a
Mm.
power base, basically.
What kind of research do you do, and how long do you spend researching before you begin writing for your book?
I started out I start out with pioneer memoirs because that's a narrative. So things can sort of hang on that. And the downside of that is that they will be in conflict with each other. Um, Even friends and colleagues will remember things differently. So there were these two journalists, St. Paul journalists, who arrived in the city within like just 4 years of each other, I think. Even though they would have were recalling the same events, writing about the same things, they would sometimes like have slightly conflicting impressions or details.
Hmm.
Um, so sometimes I I would try to verify things with like a third source because by that point they were newspapers.
Mm.
Before that, it was only I could only use memoirs and like War Department records from Fort Snelling and things like
Mm.
that. And so I would try to find a newspaper that where neither of them were on the staff to see like a neutral party what they had to say about it.
With your works being about true crime, how do you determine what elements from your research to include in the work?
With the Minneapolis one, it was fairly easy because I could pull anecdotes, and I just sort of highlight the most exciting or interesting things. And it's not all crime as we think about it. There's industrial accidents, including
Mm,
the I covered the explosion of the Washburn Mill, for example, in that book, and a labor strike. And so it was like events that were significant to Minneapolis in the 19th century. But with St. Paul, if it's more complex political history, it had to be a narrative from start to finish. So the first one is anecdotes, and in the chapters, you might or might not see the same people again. Um, Whereas in this one, a lot of even the crime stuff doesn't make quite as much sense unless you have the context. In this one, the St. Paul one, you're much more likely to see the same people from one chapter to the next, and their stories are much more interwoven.
While you're writing the historical events, what are the ethics of writing from that research and putting them into a work like St. Paul Murder and Mayhem?
You want to balance informing people who are interested in this topic with being respectful to the people of the past who have had very bad things happen to them. And with the ethics of that, I make an effort to keep my feelings out of it. There's no need, in my opinion, to ramp things up. I feel like the reader will be able to make their own moral judgments. In history writing, you're supposed to try to keep yourself out of it, but
Hmm.
with this topic, it's so charged. But I did make an effort, and I do believe that readers will share my respect and often admiration for the some of the people I write about, and disgust for
Mm.
others.
What was one of the hardest stories to write about?
On the small scale, the family annihilator. That was hard. That one was dark. But then, and this is the same with the Minneapolis one too. Writing about the series of land thefts
Mm,
through treaties and war was harrowing, like
mm,
nightmare inducing. Um, that was just the systemic persecution for the sake of property and land and money.
mhm,
It's really terrible to write about.
mm. I would imagine as you're doing your research and you're writing that you're getting some feedback from readers or from mentors or advisors. How do you take in that feedback as you're writing the work that you do?
I find that what I tend to do when readers flag things as being unclear is I just rewrite the passage. So the alternative they might give me is maybe in their voice and not my voice. But what's the important thing is that what I said wasn't clear, or wasn't phrased well. So I don't do like a word for word substitution, but I'm like, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Mm,
I would rewrite it so still in my own voice, but look at the uh, core of what they found unnecessarily uh, verbose.
hmm.
If we're talking about prose, or I just if I something was unclear, like I've added more details for context. In some cases, I took out entire paragraphs and put them as footnotes,
Mm.
because it's like one of my big things is there's so much that interests me that and so this is why it's really important for me to have readers. And they'll tell me this doesn't fit the narrative. So be like, this is a cool fun fact. So like if you go and look at the notes, you'll see like there's some that notes that are like end notes that are like one or two paragraphs. And we can thank my readers. Being like that, yeah, that's interesting. It doesn't belong here.
Is there a certain journey that you want your readers to take with St. Paul Murder and Mayhem?
I would like for them to see it as it was, as it developed. St. Paul is a very respectable place now. It was built on something very, very dark and very disreputable. And that legacy isn't extinguished, nor will it ever be. So I think it's important to go back and see how things were,
Hmm.
like see the tree roots.
Well, I talk to a lot of new writers and newly published authors, and one of the questions that some of them grapple with is whether or not to write under a pseudonym. So I'm curious your decision to write under a pseudonym versus your name.
Really, because I've published academically under my real name, and those publications have like mathy stuff in them, like a lot of numbers, and it's not written for a general audience. So if people are in the true crime section, and I understand, that there is a lot of competition. There's a lot of great authors in this genre, a lot of well-written books. And if people can't decide, are having trouble just from looking, um, and then they like look up me versus some other author, and if what comes up when they look up my real name, Marie Wu, they're going to find things that are about like statistical models. So I could totally understand someone be like, this will be boring. Like I'm here for true crime, not math. Like
Yes.
I left this behind in like junior year of high school. This name in particular is because I'm just absolutely, I love Minnesota. And I think it's beautiful. The name means from a beautiful place.
I just have one more question because the other thing that young writers or new writers and people who are just published often wonder about is the discovery phase. So, what led you to be published with the History Press?
I had a friend who was a fellow historian. We went to grad school together, and her name is Sharon Park, and she wrote a few blog posts for Minnepedia, which is the Minnesota Historical Society's blog. Was while she was working there, and the acquisitions editor from the History Press read some of her work on there, and he actually contacted her and asked her to write a book. And she happened to, I mean, of course, she knew me, and she knew that I not only had a master's in history, but that I was currently studying criminology in a sociology department at the U of M. And so she gave me his contact information. And then I went back and forth with him, and I submitted a proposal and wrote the Minneapolis book. And then the St. Paul book sprang out of that.
Well, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been fascinating hearing about your technique and the way you research and the way you write. Really looking forward to reading both books. sounds very interesting to hear more about the beginnings of our state through the stories that you've shared with us. So just want to share with everyone, be sure to get your copy of St. Paul Murder Mayhem. It was published on October 2nd, 2023 by Arcadia Publishing through their imprint, The History Press. Thank you, Marie, very much.